To have you here today. The seminar aims to foster a deeper understanding of how economic principles can be effectively applied to address some of the most pressing environmental challenges facing the world today. We're very fortunate to have not one, but two distinguished climate economists. We have Gernot Wagner and Massimo Tovoni to discuss the economics of solar radiative management. And so before I introduce our guests, here's just a few guidelines for the talk. If you have a question during the talk, you can put it in the chat, and hopefully our presenters will be able to see it there, and they can answer if they think it's important to, or we'll save it for the Q&A at the end. There's about 15 to 20 minutes, I think, of Q&A at the end. So Gernot Wagner is a distinguished economist and academic currently serving at Columbia Business School in New York. Since 2023, he's been faculty director of the Climate Knowledge Initiative and held the position of senior lecturer in the economics division since 2022. His work primarily focuses on climate economics and policy, emphasizing how economic incentives and governmental policies affect environmental outcomes and sustainability. Massimo Tovoni is a full professor at the School of Management in Milan, and he's a scientific director of the RFF-CMCC, European Institute on Economics and the Environment. His research is about climate change mitigation policies, and he's appeared in major scientific journals. He's a lead author of the IPCC, the fifth and sixth assessments, and he co-directs the International Energy Workshop and was deputy editor for Climate Change, the journal. So the insights and opinions that our colleagues are sharing today are informed by their extensive research, academic policy experience, and it's important to note, just like while both have been affiliated with many prestigious institutions, these views are expressly their own and do not necessarily represent those of EDF. I just want to make sure I say that. But so without further ado, I introduce to you Gernot and Massimo. Please begin whenever you're ready.
Cool. Thanks so much, David, for this generous introduction. Great to be here. Great to be back, I should say, at EDF. And no, I'm not speaking either on behalf of the president and fellows of Columbia University, nor of anyone at EDF, of course. I should also say that it is my, sorry about that. It is my a job here in some sense to do a bit of the setup, and then Massimo will do quite a bit more cleanup and go into some of the economic modeling details. And frankly, it is always appropriate when one talks about SRM, solar radiation management, solar geoengineering, albedo modification, whatever the name, to start with the fact that it is not plan A of what we are trying to do here, right? So not news to anyone here, but of course we have to cut emissions. Yes, there's adaptation. Yes, there is carbon removal. But here's the hard part, right? I think we know enough already that we know that there is plenty of hurt built into that, what one might call standard view of the world. So yes, plan A involves suffering, and no, there is no plan B, right? When you say economics of SRM, yeah, there's this thing out there, bestseller even, that introduced some of that to a broader audience. And well, all you need to do is read the other words in that subtitle to realize that this was one of these gee whiz, oh, you don't have to deal with the boring old carbon tax, carbon pricing, anything. Didn't you know there is this solution out there? And yes, of course, this gets political very, very quickly. It was the height of the Waxman-Markey Obama-era climate policy push that the former Speaker of the House wrote an op-ed basically saying, told you so, you don't have to vote for the cap and trade system. There is this solution out there, which it is not. It is not a solution to climate change. But maybe, possibly, could it be part of, could solar geoengineering, solar radiation management, be in fact part of what you might call this modified plan A plus? Okay, just very quickly what we are talking about here. Yes, the fundamentals are essentially trying to make the planet more reflective in a very rough, large sense of the term. Always dangerous for an economist to be describing this. But yes, it's solar radiation management. It is in many ways focused on stratospheric aerosols within that, i.e. a global intervention. So no, we're not talking about the New York City Cool Roofs program, nor are we talking about necessarily marine cloud brightening, although of course that is part of the broader picture, but it has very, very different characteristics. It is not necessarily a global intervention by default. Okay, what does all of that lead to? Well, one view, and again, part of the very sort of fundamental look here of what we are doing, very highly scientific graph here, literally started on a napkin, but if we burn fossil fuels forever, climate risk, various dimensions of climate risk will go up forever. If we cut emissions to zero, we'll stop the risk going up. But at least in our lifetimes, it's not yet coming down, not significantly, which is where carbon removal enters the picture. And yes, SRM could, possibly should, be part of this overall climate policy portfolio where we are trying to take the edge off the maximum hurt here, the maximum climate risk. Okay, so that's Climate Science 101. Happy to go into some more details later, but why have economists talk about this? Well, that's where we are shifting to dollars and cents. And again, the very fundamental first check, yes, this stuff is potentially very, very cheap. And when I say cheap, it is cheap in this narrow sense of those doing the geoengineering, the solar geoengineering, not necessarily the broad societal costs, societal risks, especially, but simply the engineering costs are very, very cheap. Right? The most expensive thing we can do is not do anything about climate change. Unmitigated climate change is the most expensive path. Cutting emissions is cheaper, pays for itself many times over, but we're still talking single-digit trillions of dollars of costs a year in order to cut global net emissions to zero. Here we are talking single-digit billions of dollars, right? Arguably 2 to 3 orders of magnitude less. Or put in sort of economic terms, yep, the reason why we are here is the free rider problem. And solar geoengineering, in many ways, has the opposite characteristic, has these free driver characteristics. It is so cheap that, if anything, the puzzle might be here, and in many ways, sort of the theoretical puzzle. And yes, Marty Weitzman wrote a very good model on precisely this question, is some of the logic just gets turned on its head. And the puzzle is, why aren't we seeing it already if it is so cheap to do? The question then isn't if, but when this might happen, right? And it is within this context that many of these research conversations are happening. Many of the questions are happening where, even if you don't like it, I hope nobody likes solar geoengineering as an intervention, but in some sense, it doesn't quite matter, because if it's only a question of time, if it's only a question of when, then yeah, we better research this topic. Okay, now there's bazillion ways to slice and dice this, and Massimo will dive some more into the models. But here's just one look, which is a decidedly economic one, which is this question of moral hazard, right? The behavioral effects. What are the effects? What are the trade-offs here? The hard trade-offs between solar geoengineering, solar radiation management, SG, SRM, and cutting CO2 in the first place. Okay, so first, yes, there are potentially some real hard trade-offs. And I'm not saying this is the correct calculation here, but again, it's the starting point of these conversations. Right? So just thought experiment. If one were to use solar geoengineering as the only instrument to stabilize temperatures, and you do it in a big way, and in fact achieve that, stabilize temperatures, keep them constant throughout the rest of this century, not the intervention we should be shooting for, but what if? Well, yeah, you actually reduce the carbon burden as well. Why? You turn off carbon cycle feedbacks, and then the very economic, single-minded, autistic calculation of what that is per ton of CO2, and you come up with really, really low costs. And again, this is not the right way to look at the economics of solar geoengineering, but it leads to the starting point that says, whoa, this is so cheap. It must be only a matter of time before somebody somewhere, nation state, not necessarily, of course, an individual in this case, but is pursuing this as a potential intervention. And then there's this bit. Then there is Christine Merck, quite a while ago, full disclosure, by now a co-author, but this was with two of her German colleagues. SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection. The study, 600 Germans, 3 groups. One group was told about climate change. The other group was told about climate change and tipping points and how bad it's going to be. And the third group was told about climate change and stratospheric aerosol injection. Typically, when one talks about solar geoengineering in this context, in this behavioral context, we invoke this moral hazard specter. If we talk about it, we might deter people from, in fact, cutting CO2 emissions. She finds the opposite. She finds that when you tell those 200 Germans about SRM, you are sort of shocking them into action. You are motivating them to do more than they otherwise would to cut emissions in the first place. Now, in this case, it was via voluntary offsets, and now we can talk about the problems associated with that. But at the very least, it is a topic, I would say, worth studying, precisely because there might be a way to talk about solar geoengineering in a way that doesn't detract from the need to cut emissions, but in fact leads more people to want to do more. And of course, when a scientist says this is worth studying, then the next slide will show their own study of just that. What we did, so this is now Christina and I working together, in some sense the exact opposite. Instead of paying 600 people, we observe or we experiment on 300,000 people, Facebook experiment, online experiment. And there are a lot of different ways to interpret this. One is to simply say that Christina and I are just really bad marketers. As in, if you had somebody who knew what they were doing, they could figure out a way to get any effect they want. And in fact, we sort of observed that too. We are good enough marketers to be able to shock people into either this moral hazard effect on the one hand, or the inverse on the other. But when you don't try very hard with the sort of shock effect, but in fact try to talk about SRM, solar geoengineering, in a semi-rational, semi-sensible way. What we observe by and large is that, yes, there are ways to talk about it without invoking either the moral hazard on the one hand or the inverse on the other, right? We may want to invoke the inverse quite directly, a lot more directly. But at the end of the day, maybe this specter of moral hazard ought not be the one guiding our conversations. Or maybe, just grand conclusion before I hand it over to Massimo, it ought not to be a cutting CO2 versus geoengineering, either carbon removal, of course, or solar geoengineering, but it ought to be the combination, or more specifically, and more sort of with a researchy hat on, no, this isn't really moral hazard so much as it ought to be a discussion about the trade-offs of risks, unmitigated climate change on the one hand, and potential solar geoengineering intervention on top of climate action on the other. I'll stop here for now, hand it over to Massimo, and of course, very happy to dive into any of this and other topics in much, much more detail. Thank you.
All right. So first of all, thanks, Gernot. You made a great introduction. What I'm going to try to say in these next 20 minutes, and I try to go a little bit more into the details about the methods that economists use to understand this issue and to what extent research in this space. We're not talking actually doing any real implementation. We're talking about doing research on SRM can be important also for organizations in general for researchers interested in this topic. And you already see from the subtitle that, of course, going into the details of the methods also make you think maybe twice or thrice, and then here the subtitle trying to be as humble as possible given specifically given this topic. So what is the economic contribution to SRM research? I think Gernot already went through some of that, but the first one is the classical benefit cost analysis, a classical tool in economics. Its very normative approach is essentially asking how much SRM should we do for the sake of a global good, when, how, what happens to other climate strategies, CO2 removal, mitigation, and so forth. And there's classical tools are numerical simulation, models even. It doesn't have to be necessarily always complicated. I'm going to be discussing a little bit about this. This is just the introduction of the three kind of main contributions that I will be briefly going through. The second one is, governance and cooperation. This is more descriptive. What might happen if some countries pursue SRM based on their self-interest? What are the repercussions for international climate policy? And economists here have used a lot of tools, often drawing from the toolbox of has been used a lot in this kind of context. And then there's human behavior, and Gernot just showed a result of that from a Facebook experiment. Again, it's descriptive. They ask about public perceptions and human and behaviors, and behavioral economics and behavioral sciences in general have actually contributed to this field as well. Actually, pretty much a much growing field. Is actually larger than one thinks when reviewing that. And there are many papers published in all these three kind of buckets. Let me offer some of my kind of reading of this literature. I will referring, of course, somehow more to my research than to the others, mostly because that's the one I know better. But as I said, it's pretty large, actually. And let me start from the first one, benefit cost assessments, which has been maybe, the most commonly used. What is the economically optimal level of SRM deployment from a global perspective? Suppose you want to do the good for the planet. We are well-intentioned, and what should we do? Now, this actually goes back a long time. A standard, very well-known model, the DICE model, a Nobel Prize awarded. And already early 90s, the main authors, William Nordhaus, was pointing to the fact that indeed, from the economic point of view, and I think this resonates also what Gernot just showed, SRM becomes attractive to do its low implementation cost. and effectiveness. And actually, in those scenarios, was actually even reducing greenhouse gas reductions, which is something that, as I think Arnold said very well, we don't want to consider or take too seriously. But of course, when you look into this literature, which has evolved since the 90s, it turns out that it is quite sensitive to the parameterization. It's still largely unknown, not so much on the direct cost, but the indirect cost, the effectiveness, and so forth. And in a way, you have a situation like in this paper where you have the benefits here of doing or several. If you stay on the BAU, so you continue your fossil fuel, your welfare, happiness is actually pretty low. This is not what we want, obviously. If you reduce emissions, actually it's much better. We know that it pays off by itself. But the question is, what if you do geoengineering? And in this paper specifically, there were two scenarios, and you often get into these two camps, very divisive. It's certainly very cheap. It might be, but it might actually be not actually very, very, very good. So this literature, in a way, I think it has exhausted its stream, and I would say with standard tools is also how heroic and often inconclusive. You can still think about benefit of cost assessment, but then you should take account of the key uncertainties, and they need to be properly be accounted for. Uncertainty are in many ways in climate, in SRM, of course, also on climate hazards on one end, and of course, runaway risks. And of course, in this kind of risk framework, that certainly makes the value of SRM go up, because what we are seeing or observing already right now is incredibly large hazards for the warming that we have already, is not little, but the warming that we have been committed already, and we have more warming coming. The remediation potential is obvious, but it's also in certain dimensions not fully explored and not fully clear. Now, on the other hand, of course, the uncertainty on SRM, its effectiveness side effects, lowers the value of SRM and makes mitigation adaptation essential. So it becomes a question of strategy that edges away the risks. And from this, it's pretty obvious, or has been obvious, that the false dichotomy in which you should do less emissions because you're going to have CO2 removal, SRM, sorry, as per the quote that Gernot showed at the beginning, is actually meaningless, in the sense that unless you are extremely sure, this is the probability of being sure that SRM works very, very well in the best possible way, unless you are extremely sure, or you are completely to the right in this chart, and depending on the parameterization that we have in this paper, there's no way you should give up doing a lot of work on emission reductions. On the governance, which is maybe even more interesting than the benefit cost assessment, I would say for sure, and the repercussion for international cooperation, there's a large literature. It builds upon standard work in environmental economics, on free riding and strategic incentives. It adds new strategic behavior dynamics. It's not just free riding as intended typically by the environmental economics, but is, as already Gernot showed before, free driving. Countries with largest preference for cooling driving the SRM decisions quite unilaterally at the expense of all the others. And there is work that actually looked at both free riding and free driving and trying to compare which one of the two is actually the most worrisome one, and to what extent, moral hazard on the one end, that is the tendency of reduced CO2 emission effort, versus the risk that we actually end up doing too much of SRM because of free driving, can actually be compared. We did this in an article a few years ago with the co-author. And what we showed in that article is actually that the moral hazard issue was secondary to the actually free driving problem. So you see here in this chart to the right, here it's just in the two different colors. It's just a word that cooperates and the word where every country does its own interest. Of course, one word is much better than the other, but that's not the point of the chart. The point of the chart in comparing these two colors, and also whether you do have SRM or not, the shaded and the solid line versus dotted lines, shows that exactly the risk that free driving appears is actually a very significant risk. And you would end up in the red to the right panel curve with a lot of SRM, much more than you would need. You might need, even in a perfect world, just a little to shave off the peak of warming and risks. but it might end up that because we are not cooperating, obviously, we don't have full international cooperation at global level, you might end up with way too much cooling, and that will be suboptimal in many, many ways for the entire world. So that is one of the key issues coming up from the literature, is actually one of the main concerns also when thinking about SRM. And then there's also thinking, how does SRM changes the incentives to participate in international environmental agreements? We want to make progress in environmental agreements, not make sure that those are stopped or delayed because of SRM. And there's actually a very big literature, which I'm not summarizing, but essentially, it finds that having SRM can actually sustain coalition if SRM is credible threat to emission reductions, and that by itself can actually lead countries to actually commit to serious climate policies, because of the risk that if those commitments could not come through, then SRM can come in, and actually, obviously, the consequences for everyone will actually be worse off. But on the other hand, SRM would need to play a significant role, and given all the uncertainties that we just discussed in the previous 2 slides, that also raises its own challenges. And again, sorry for self-quoting papers, a recent paper looking a lot of coalitions and possible countries coming together and agreeing. You see many, many dots here. Each dot is a coalition, and we analyzed a large number of those, and it turns out that actually we can find many situations where we have coalition of countries coming together that respect the Paris Agreement targets of 1.5 to 2 degrees. So those points are within those kind of yellow and light yellow shaded areas. Those are stable coalitions that actually meet the Paris Agreement, that are compliant with the long-term Paris Agreement targets in terms of temperature. However, what turns out to be these positive results is actually limited also by the fact that there's way too much SRM being deployed to make sure that the planet is cooled enough to stay below these temperature targets. You would like to be in that kind of purple color, which is GC, Grand Coalition. That would be the place where you would like to be. That's very much to the right, where you would do most of the work through emission reductions. But instead, you often might find yourself, or could find ourselves, in situations where temperature is kept under control, but where actually we don't achieve those temperature reductions sufficiently enough through emission reductions, but also very significantly through significant cooling through SRM. And then there's the human behavioral part, how people respond. These are mostly models. I assume, people respond in certain ways. We know from behavioral economics, people respond in very different ways. And that's, a very important contribution in economics, that those of behavioral sciences in the past 20, 30 years. And this field, even in SRM, there's been significant contributions here. There's been a lot of surveys and experiments of various sorts on public acceptance. There's been a lot of surveys on the experts' views, try to get an understanding of what people think my SRM might entail. And there's also been actually more formal behavioral economic experiments in the tradition of experimental economics, looking at issues such as cooperation, free driving, and so on. Some of the same thing we just showed before in the models, but actually tested with actually real people actions and real people decisions in a variety of different contexts. So again, reporting on a paper we wrote, doing a laboratory experiments with a number of students at the university, and we were trying to test experimentally whether free driving could appear in the lab or not. And what we found in that experiment is in this complicated chart here. I'll briefly walk you through, and then I'm about to end my presentation. You have global engineering. It's a very stylized figure, but you have global engineering on the x-axis, and essentially your social optimum is that upper bullet that gives you the maximum, maximum happiness or maximum welfare that you could have. And we had predictions about what people would do in a baseline scenario. So the standard baseline, by baseline we mean a standard scenario, which we were predicting actually that actually we would have too much geoengineering. That point is actually to the right of where we should be. And also that would, of course, consequently reduce the global benefits and the global welfare of SRM. And what we actually realized, meaning what people actually played in the lab, was very close to the prediction. So again, way too much geoengineering, essentially confirming free driving almost perfectly, and the loss in welfare as expected. So this is a case where a real experiment confirmed the theory. But in the same chart, we also have a case where the actual real experiment didn't confirm the theory, because we also had a treatment where we had counter geoengineering, where players could actually punish through countermeasures, essentially by hypothetically, warming up the atmosphere, warming up the planet by injecting particles in the atmosphere that would do so. And we were predicting things to go pretty bad through geoengineering, not so much in terms of how much cooling you would get. The two things, plus and minus geoengineering, would roughly cancel off, but you would have a loss of welfare of about 2/3. And what in fact we found was that actually players realized a very, a variety of strategies that led to a variety of solutions that were away from the optimal and that reduced global welfare very significantly. So you end up in that lower bottom black square where you had huge welfare losses. And there are many behavioral reasons behind these results, but we showed also to what extent some of these behavioral mechanisms really depend on what kind of options are on the table. To kind of summarize and looking at the caveats, I would say current economic assessments often either avoid or rely on simplified assumptions, and this is standard. It might be specifically in this case that some of these assumptions are likely wrong. And so some of these are things where we have to pay particular attention. The incredible economics of geoengineering, which already Gernot somehow alluded to, how cheap it is, it comes actually from a paper that actually used data from the early 90s. This is true from a purely direct economic point of view, but there are certainly, and Gernot has actually even written about this, huge technical barriers to high altitude sulfur injections that make the practicality of SRM much more complicated than one would think it is by just judging the pure cost numbers. And this is something we should take very seriously. There are very few countries that have capacity right now or even in the foreseeable future to do SRM if it has to be done in the proper way. Of course, it could be done even in worse ways. There are indirect costs which we don't understand. The impacts, especially on hydrological cycle, especially for injections away from the equator. There's well-known climate evidence that this can have significant implications on rainfall patterns, especially along the tropical areas, and that has major consequences, obviously, for well-being and also for economics. There are more others which have been discussed already. And of course, literature is largely focused on SAI. There are now emerging other SRM techniques which have other pros and cons that should be looked at. From the global north, which also has somehow limited incentives to do SRM, at least in the very short term. Somehow the global south is skeptical. See, for example, the recent United Nations debate where the risk framework was accused of being a false dichotomy. So what we see in the real practice is, contrary to what we would expect, a lot of reticence towards SRM, especially in places where you would expect there would be actually more interest in doing so. And the reasons are many, and they speak vastly to the issues of the governance of SRM, which is extremely complicated. To conclude, just a couple of references to things that we have done. We have tried to expand the research domain towards social sciences to inform geoengineering through a series of workshops that culminated in a policy forum paper with a lot of scholars in the field, including Gernot, that we published now a couple of years ago. There's, together with the Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C., we've been doing a series of workshops. There's a new one actually coming up in the end of September, just announced today. So happy to provide further information. There's an open call for papers also. about the role of cooperation and non-cooperation on SRM. Just highlighting some of the new initiatives, and just let me end simply with where I started. I think in economic profit in general, there's a tendency, obviously, to try to simplify things to the bare minimum, because then you can make models tractable. But humility and humbleness in a field like this are even more important. Many of the assumptions that sometimes economists give for granted on the science, on the ecosystem impacts, on the nature consequences, and even more importantly, on those soft aspects related to governance and political science and human behavior, are actually going to be very determinant in this field. And so be humble was my last word, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. So please, yeah, this was a wonderful talk. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but please raise your hand and I can call you in order. I can also start asking the first question too. If there's no immediate questions, I have at least one. Okay, so I will ask my question. So I've never thought about free driving. It's really interesting. And I guess I have a question about the private benefits of SRM. There's local cooling likely. I don't know the answer to this. So I don't know much about the science about SRM. So this is me asking several questions at once. What are the private benefits? Why would there be free driving? They're not doing it for public benefits or societal welfare, but they're doing it for private gain for some reason. And then there's too much of it because is it seen as an adaptation? Can I think of it that way? Or am I thinking about it as a way of getting out of your commitment? I guess that's what I'll pose the question that way. And either of you can take it.
Happy to take a first crack, and then Massimo, you'll play cleanup as before. So I guess, so two bits. So one is SAI, at least, stratospheric aerosols, unless done stupidly. There are, that's sort of, what if you did the hemispheric version and cooled only one hemisphere, the northern or the southern, and so on, right? So lots of things can go wrong, but uniformly applied has fairly uniform effects, right? So it is not the quote unquote local cooling effect. And there's actually, there's lots and lots of studies on this. And actually Massimo alluded to this, right? There's literally hundreds of peer-reviewed studies on this topic by now. Here's just one, which in some sense shows this uniformity of the results, which is actually surprising up to a point. Maybe, maybe not. But it is certainly a core characteristic of SCI, right? So David, to your question, it's not that if you were to do this, above your head, it would cool you and nobody else, right? So that's not the effect here. What is, and frankly, in some sense, this comes back to this core characteristic of the potential impact, benefits, if you will, net benefits to the personal engineering costs is just so large, right? So the subtitle here alludes to this. 1 gram of SO2, the equivalent of offsetting the warming effects, average warming effects of 1 ton of CO2. That there are some sort of back of the envelope calculation. Actually, the one that sticks to my mind is sort of as so often with these anecdotes, it's not correct. But Massimo is in Milan. In this case, it was this hypothetical: what if the mayor of Venice were able to quote unquote solar geoengineer the planet? Okay, it costs order of magnitude $10 billion to do. Okay, if you were to be able to stop global sea level rise through this intervention and quote unquote save Venice, do you save enough real estate to make it worth it? Now, the reason why it doesn't work is, right, Venice is sinking for other reasons. So SRM alone isn't going to do this. But this just shows the orders of magnitude involved here, right? So the free driving is basically quite literally that one country could potentially spend the money and it pays for this country to do so, assuming you link certain positive effects to positively affecting the said country. City might be the extreme example, but still, right? So it's a sort of an order of magnitude question, 10,000 to 1,000 to 1, that leads to this conclusion.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I saw Lisa's hand go up first, and then Jeremy, and then Brian.
Thanks so much. Great talks, really interesting. And my question is also about the free driving. Can you guys hear me okay? Sorry. Yeah, okay. So question about the kind of what you mentioned, Massimo, at the end of your talk about some of the assumptions, and especially I'm thinking about the one about the technical challenge of delivering stratospheric aerosols to the atmosphere at 20 kilometers, like how does that interact with the idea of free drivers? Because it feels, it feels like, I mean, I believe there's only a certain number of countries that have, well, no one has the capability now. Only certain numbers of countries have the capability to develop a fleet of aircraft, let's say, that could deliver stratospheric cooling for the planet. And so how many, I mean, Venice can't do this really. I mean, like there isn't really that many actors. There aren't that many actors who can really realistically do this. So I'm just wondering how free driving works out in a theory sense when it collides with the physical or with the engineering challenge of like only so many actors are going to have access to the planes and it takes some time to ramp this up too. It's not something that, despite what everyone's read in the media about make sunsets or balloons or things, it really doesn't work with a small, tiny amount. Like you need a really pretty big commitment to building the planes that can deliver it, at least as far as I understand it. Anyway, could you say more about those? Is that a challenge to free driving, or like how does that work out with the concept of free driving?
Yeah, maybe I can chip in here. I think it's a great question, and actually, I think often in terms of simplified assumptions, we assume all countries can do it, even small ones, whereas in fact it's obvious that they are not. And so all these theoretical results and also the experiments are actually based on the idea that actually this can be done everywhere. And so that might actually be that the free driving risk is overestimated simply because we are just overestimating the capacity of those countries which would be most in need. In that experiment, the most in need are the ones which are hottest, most adversely affected by climate change, most likely to be in the global south, which, however, as you just pointed out, might just not have the capacity of doing so. So you might think, okay, good, free driving problem is solved. Well, up to a certain degree, this might be true, of course, but we have some nations which might have the capacity of doing that. It could be done in not perfect ways at maybe lower altitudes. It could be done at different latitudes where you don't need to go as high. And if that happens, it might actually mess things up even more to some degree, because what just Gerald showed before, the good compensation in temperature and not messing up the hydrological and then the precipitation part works if it's done in the proper way at the right latitude. As soon as, and we're working on some stuff on this, on also the implication for governance, as soon as you deviate and you're starting it maybe 20, 30 degrees north or even more north, then you're going to, of course, create a lot of other problems. So from one point of view, it mitigates the actual immediate risks that something as bad might happen, but it also raises scenarios in which SRM might be not deployed suboptimally, which is often something which these models not consider, not focused directly on. Not sure if I properly answered.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Maybe just to add 30 seconds. So I just put it into the chat as well. So, right. So, of course, it's back of the envelope. But yes, there are 5,000 or so countries whose Air Force budget alone exceeds this sort of $10 billion. Now, okay, none of this means that they have the capacity, but right, as a starting point for this conversation. Now, that said, actually, one of the extreme scenarios has often been, what about green finger? what about the crazy billionaire doing it themselves, right? And well, no, right? So this is, you have a private plane, you take out the seats and you start geoengineering, right? Like, no, that's not how any of this works.
Thank you. I think I was next. I'll jump in if that's right, Lisa. Cool. Well, thank you so much for the great talk. I had a sort of a two-part question, more about the moral hazard argument and some of the studies that the surveys that you were talking about, Gernot. So one, I'm kind of wondering how the surveys at the individual level translate to sort of the game theory at the nation state level, in terms of like climate policy ambition. And I'm wondering if there's research on that and how that the moral hazard argument translates in terms of, at that level of international negotiations. And then the second part is just wondering if in your research or other surveys, they've looked at, the importance of like cultural context and values. As you know, Rainer Romero, our social scientist here, has done a ton of work that shows kind of how those play such an important role in like, how those issues are viewed. So like whether audiences are more or less conservative or whether countries are more or less isolationist, I think probably has a big role to play in at least like dictating the degree of moral licensing to mitigate less, probably. So I just wonder if you've looked into that.
Great question. So, and Massimo, you should jump in too. But so just quickly, frankly, one of the huge caveats of any of this moral hazard work is at the end of the day, right? What, the median voter, for example, thinks, right, matters a lot less than the institutional dynamics, what political leaders think, for example, right? So yeah, I'd like to think that these moral hazard, these surveys and lab experiments and so on are useful, but okay, go do that with climate negotiators as opposed to with, the average Facebook user, let's say, right? So I think there's certainly a bit of that. Second, since I'm spamming you with some of my own links here, so here's another one, which I think addresses exactly your question, right? So game theory at the international level. Can one imagine a scenario? And well, okay, in this case, very, very simple. There's not much game theory here. This is literally, right, prisoner's dilemma with a third dimension. The third is geoengineering. The availability of geoengineering, what might that do in the simplest of possible game theoretic setups? And the short version is that, yeah, it might introduce this new dimension into climate negotiations, and I'm of course deliberately putting in quotation marks, where the availability of geoengineering alone, solar geoengineering alone, might lead to a different outcome. Okay, in this case, what we are arguing is that it might make high mitigation scenarios, a more ambitious climate agreement, more likely. Why? In some sense, those who don't like solar geoengineering at all, would like to mitigate more to avoid it, and those who are already predisposed to wanting to do more, right, are using it now to basically shock everyone else with the threat of solar geoengineering to want to do more. So, okay, just one scenario, and whiteboard economics, right? No, this is not how negotiations work. On the other hand, maybe there is something, once again, to this inverse moral hazard aspect that might, in fact, elevate this conversation as opposed to have solar geoengineering research detract from the need to cut emissions.
Very helpful. Thank you. We'll check out the link.
Hey, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's me. Thanks so much. This was fascinating. I love the social science angle and the game theory angle. I was sort of thinking as you were talking about a research agenda and like how we might build on this in terms of addressing the things you're doing and decision-making processes. And I'm just wondering, in your studies, have you got a sense of what additional information those folks wanted when they were making the decisions or playing the game, in terms of what they would support, and in particular, like how how does the information folks would want, and again, thinking forward to information we don't have right now, so it's sort of just thinking ahead, how did that differ between, say, scientists that were involved in these processes versus, you know, a college student that may have played the game versus the decision makers that you were just talking about and the politicians you were just talking about?
I mean, I can say a few words about the experiments, and then you can say a few words about the surveys on which I have a more limited experience. Some of these experiments, since they are designed to be very clean and try to understand the mechanisms, are actually in the kind of tradition of economics typically unframed. That is, geoengineering specifically is not mentioned, but you try to understand more general behavior for tradition in let's say in traditional economic games. The standard economic gains that economists use is public good experiments. In that case, we were twisting it towards the public bad and with the addition of geoengineering, but participants would not understand or see directly the consequences on it on the planet. We were trying to understand something more general. This is for the unframed experiments. From the understood that speaks more generally about kind of general behavior characteristic or general behavioral rules. But I would say, and I think Arnold maybe can add more, on the surveys, I think the framing matters a lot. The understanding of SRM is actually very low. Well, people have a hard time even understanding the standard mitigation, let alone something, you know, so exotic. So there's from what I'm reading of the literature on survey, this is a major limitation, and I think there's a lot of need in trying to explain and educate people on what are the trade-offs. And of course, as kind of a recurrent theme, you have to also explain how uncertain the things are. And that makes it, of course, complicated, right? I mean, go explain uncertainty to it's hard. We know that very well. We know, but of course you cannot shy away from doing that in a case like this. I think in general there's been many attempts. There's been a lot of interest in this service to try and understand the mechanisms against the for public support or away from public support of this kind of interventions. I think oftentimes these interventions are framed of standalone. But I think it really matters whether people understand that these are part of a broader strategy for solving climate change. And that is often not conceived. You can come to you and ask you, what do you think about SAI? By the way, this is SAI. The way I'm going to frame it to you in the survey will potentially drive some of the results. And it's out on context with respect to the other options that we have, and we should actually be focused on largely. So I think doing a much better work and much more work in explaining what are the options also in terms of reducing emission and adapting, and certainly better work in explaining what are the SRM options, which are realistic also, would help go a long way in making these surveys much more relevant for useful decisions. Besides, going towards also experts have been interviewed a lot, but the experts are a special crowd. I think, policymakers are certainly a place where you might want also to ask, or decision makers in general.
Yeah, maybe to pile on, right? So, I mean, yes, a core characteristic, Massimo said this, people don't know what solar geoengineering is. And it's an amazing sense. So you put out a survey, you ask them, right, do you know? And even the 5-10% who do tell you that they know, when you ask them to define it, they actually get it more wrong. Those who tell you that they know, right, as usual, right, get it more wrong than those who humbly say, actually, please explain it to me, right? Yeah, there's a lot of the frankly, an aspect of this, just to be clear, is this sort of early days, and everything is political, right? So, I mean, to me, it just feels like talking about solar geoengineering today feels like talking about adaptation in the mid-90s, right? Where back then you literally had, you had the then vice president on the record saying, "Thou shalt not talk about adaptation. Let's solve this thing first, right? Let's get Kyoto done first. And then, then let's talk about adaptation." Okay, fast forward 10 years, right? And every environmental group on the planet used adaptation in 2005 or so, right? The threat of, oh, wow, things are so bad already, we need to adapt. as the need to cut emissions more at the time. And in some sense, that's the environment in which we are talking about solar geoengineering these days.
Jacob, I think you're up next.
Thanks so much. So I guess I wanted to ask you about indirect costs and side effect costs, just how you understand those and really how high those costs are in your models. So I guess my thought is like, if this will potentially make the climate significantly worse for a small or significant subset of countries, then it seems like that becomes a really central political and really like ethical challenge to this, irrespective of the moral hazard and free driver issues, because then it's not really a public good. And so I'm just wondering like how worried you are about that and how does that figure in your analysis? But thanks for a really interesting discussion.
So maybe just quickly, so hundreds of climate model runs by now, hundreds of studies, thousands of climate model runs by now. And if anything, it is surprising how uniform solar geoengineering is, right? Global solar geoengineering. Again, right? You can muck things up dramatically. And there's sort of these, headline grabbing studies of hemispheric geoengineering will turn off the Indian monsoon and so on. And yeah, right, those are real problems, of course. I don't want to diminish any of that, of course not. But so dimensions that matter, actually, what I'm thinking of is a Peter Irvine et al. Overview, Nature Climate Change. I'll look for the link in a second. 5 dimensions: average temperatures, max temperatures, average precipitation minus evaporation, maximum precipitation minus evaporation, and hurricane strength, tropical cyclone strength. And on all 5, a world with solar, right? The world we are in, unmitigated climate change plus SAI gets you closer back to pre-industrial, and in some sense, almost uniformly around the world, right? So now, of course, right, that one, pixel on the globe where that is not the case, right? That's a problem, of course, right? If you're, 95% of the world goes back closer, okay, there's 5% left that might actually go the other way. But again, best we can do at the moment is do these global circulation models and the studies resulting from them. And if anything, it is surprisingly uniform.
Let me also come in here. Yeah, I'm more worried. Let me say I'm more worried than what Gernot said. First of all, for a variety of reasons. First of all, you have to trust the GCMs on this. And I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure because this is part of the climate systems that, from what I understand, are not really completely understood and exactly properly modeled. And then, of course, there are certain variables, climatic variables, which matter for well-being. That are well known, that it's just more difficult to model and represent them. Precipitation being maybe the most important one. We know we don't know enough about the implication also for economics on precipitation. There's a lot of studies on temperature. Just another paper came out today, actually, that includes a variety of variables, including these ones. And everyone agrees that temperature is, of course, the most important one. And it's true that all these simulations show good compensation of SRM on temperature. But I think there's much more than that. And I'm worried that we are not seeing certain things. So, and plus, besides all the hydrology and precipitation, there could be other problems that we are not seeing. In general, it's true that the literature suggests that these indirect costs are actually very small. But it's also one of those parameters that when you change it, you get very different results. In one of my first slides on benefit cost analysis driven by parameterization, I mostly refer to that. And I would be very cautious here to say that we can confidently say that the indirect costs are low. It might actually well be that many are not fully understood and might be very significant.
All right, I think we're at the end of the hour. I just want to thank Gernot and Massimo. Thank you so much for this really enlightening talk, and thanks for the attendees also for wonderful questions. Yeah, I hope we get to connect again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys, for showing up. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for organizing. Bye.